Hi, my name's Caroline Beckett and I'm Vicar of Brightlingsea, and today I'm at home.
My name's Andy Griffiths. I coordinate training for the Diocese of Chelmsford, and I'm still working from home. And together we are
We are at a distance,
rethinking
rethinking.
Christian leadership. I do love the way that two people try to say something at the same time on Zoom, and there's a built-in echo. It's like the day of Pentecost. It's great.
Oh yeah, it's like a burst of many tongues. You should have heard my congregation, 24 people trying to say the Lord's Prayer on Sunday.
But isn't that beautiful? So much better than one person saying it and muting everybody else to listen.
Yeah, it's good, and actually sometimes the echoes are almost poetic. So this is episode 4. And in our first 3 conversations, we made a claim that, at least in part, Christian leadership is community organising. And that's not necessarily herding cats via Zoom. We started thinking about what community organising is as a tradition and a set of tools, a rule and a process. And we made a few suggestions about what that means in a pandemic. Today, we're going to be looking at the first step in community organising.
So what's the first step called?
So surprisingly enough, it's called organising. Community organising doesn't decide on the action we're going to take and then persuade people to get on the bus. It starts by getting people on the bus, building community and building teams. Then we can work out ways of deciding together where the bus is going to go.
And we can call that first step organising,
or team building, or community building,
or forming a relational culture. The state has a bureaucratic culture. It can't help it. It just does. And the state has power over you. If you doubt whether the state has power over you, try overthrowing it and you'll quickly find it's got a police force and it's got an army. Business has a market-oriented culture. Again, that's just the way it is. And if you work for a business, it has power over you because it can sack you.
But churches aren't the state, so they shouldn't have a bureaucratic culture. And churches aren't businesses, so they shouldn't have a market culture and consumers. Churches should have a relational culture. Churches are part of civil society, so they aren't building power over people, they're building power with people. And there's a tool we want to present for organising, or team building and community building, or forming a relational culture, and it's called a one-to-one.
Can you spell that?
Well, I usually spell it in numbers, like 121, 121. And the base unit of community organising is that one-to-one. And it's an equal, intentional, scheduled, uninterrupted conversation of around 40 to 45 minutes. It's not an interview, it's not a friendly chat, and it isn't a counselling session, but it's a conversation with a purpose. In it, 2 people share something of themselves and their self-interest. And by that I mean what they care enough about to act on, moments that have shaped them, how they spend their time, energy and money, the organisations they're part of and how they chose them. In community organising, self-interest is not a dirty word, but it's a practical acknowledgement that even our greatest acts of altruism are coloured by who we are, and that when we act on what we're actually passionate about, we're more motivated, more joyful and more powerful. If it helps you to think about self-interest, think about the charities and organisations that you currently support and ask yourself what your link or connection is with that charity. So, for example, you might know someone who works for them or has raised funds for them. You might know someone who suffered from the illness that they're raising money to cure, or you might know somebody affected by the issue that they're campaigning on, or perhaps you might have been affected by the issue they're campaigning on. You might, for example, be on the PTA of your child's school, but you wouldn't necessarily be on the random PTA of another school that your child doesn't attend. So self-interest isn't a bad thing. It's about being connected. It's about what we're connected to and what we care about. And it's helpful if Christian leaders have received some training in one-to-ones. And probably that would include a stick person. And that's a really, really simple thing. For those people who can't draw, it's deeply reassuring. You simply do a little stick person in the middle of the page and you ask yourself some questions. So you ask yourself and you write down around your stick person, what do I really care about? What are the key moments from my life? What do I spend my time on? What do I spend my energy doing? What do I spend my money on? What organisations am I part of? How did I choose them? What are the big relationships in my life? So when we know ourselves really well, and we know these things about ourselves, then we can also share that with others. And it's even better if an entire congregation can be trained this way. And it's not only about knowing ourselves, it's then about knowing those things about other people. And the most important thing is that this practice can become a normal part of church life. And I reckon every serious Christian needs a one-to-one at least once a week.
So suppose I phone someone during lockdown.
Good idea.
And I say to them, well, look, I was hoping we could take about 40 minutes to get to know each other. And then I listen really well as they tell me a story that's significant to them and tell me who the other people that matter in their life are and tell me about their gifts and their passions or dreams and hopes. Was that a one-to-one?
No, well, only half a one-to-one, because you also need to disclose your own stories and passions and significant others and gifts.
Spog.
Sorry?
Stories, passions, others, gifts. Spog. That isn't a community organising term. I just made it up.
Oh, well, fair enough. Congratulations. But the point is that a one-to-one is neither pure listening nor pure speaking. It's both. It's the basis of Christian leadership.
Yeah. And I guess there's never been a better time to embark on lots of one-to-ones than right now. You're listening for and you're disclosing things that are personal, but you're not a counsellor, so you're not probing into things that are private or over-disclosing private things about yourself. Little by little, the one-to-ones will start to change you, and they'll change what you value. And in due course, they'll change what you do. And Caroline and I are going to be saying more about that in our future episodes. Meanwhile, I'm glad to say that some people have started writing to us and telling us their experiences at a distance. You can do that too. I'm at randomlyandy@live.com.
And I'm at revcarolinebeckett@gmail.com.
For example, we've received this. Why would I get involved in community organising, says someone, when my community does this already very well without the church sticking its oar in? Maybe Christian community leadership is about providing something different from secular charities.
Yeah, so I think there is a fair point there. What often churches can tend to do, which is less than helpful, is to say, well, we're going to do this thing and it's going to be missional and it's going to be on our terms and it's going to be about us. And if we can't stick the name Jesus on everything really obviously, then we don't want to be part of it. And actually, that's a really, really unhelpful model, because it means that you get the church working in a little silo over here, and then you get the community working in a little silo over here. And the people that move between the two can actually feel quite torn in terms of their loyalties. But actually, if you want to demonstrate the love of God in action, then the best way of doing that is actually to work alongside one another on the same project. And I think sometimes churches are not very good at looking where God is already working in the community. We tend to think of ourselves as we take God out into the community as though God's not already there. But at the same time, we claim that we believe that God is everywhere. And so if we actually believe God's everywhere, then God is probably in that community project down the road that's already running. And rather than starting our own from scratch, actually what we can do is we can approach in a posture of humility something that's already good, already working, already caring, and saying, how can we help you? How can we support you? How can we work alongside you in this? But the unique thing that the church offers or that faith groups offers, because we're not just talking about the established church here, is that we are attentive to the spiritual aspect of things. And often people can be terribly good at looking after people's bodies and health and well-being, and actually we're increasingly good at looking after people, and we're beginning to bear in mind people's emotional health. But what a lot of organizations are not terribly good at always in a crisis is thinking about that spiritual dimension, thinking about those tricky questions that we push out of our minds the rest of the time, and thinking about some kind of, where do we find meaning and identity and purpose in it all. And actually, I think that's a voice that the church can offer, but not necessarily separately and just talking loudly to people who are already listening to us, but actually from within a cooperative group of people all working together. Because otherwise, of course, the accusation is, well, the church is very concerned with my spirit, but if I'm hungry, I'm more concerned with my stomach. What are you doing about that? Which is one of the reasons that so many churches run food banks, because actually the Bible is crammed full of instructions and commandments to feed the hungry and bring justice to people who are suffering injustice, and take care of the poor and visit people in prison and give people clothes if they haven't got any. The Bible is full of that from cover to cover.
Absolutely. And you see, thank you so much for providing your question, because that's what we asked you to do, and we're really not just getting at you. But I have to warn you that I think what Caroline and I are saying is even worse than what you think we're saying. I think you feel like we're saying, in addition to all the good Christian things that you're doing in your congregation, we're asking you to do this additional thing called community organizing. And you're saying, no, look, I'm willing to let other people do all that stuff. I'm going to stick with my congregational development. Now, I think we're saying something worse. I think we're saying community organizing is how we are suggesting you could do the whole of your job as a Christian leader. So this cycle we've talked about, or this process of organizing, listening, planning, taking action through public storytelling, and ensuring everyone has a place at the table, that is about the external stuff, about building alliances that are powerful with other groups in your area and so on. But it's also about how pastoral care can most effectively happen in a congregation. It's how preaching can be done in a congregation. It's how worship can be seen. It's the whole of Christian leadership. And we're saying this is one way to think about all of it. So I'm sorry about that. But we, I think, are saying something more extreme. Well, we've nearly finished this particular conversation, but I really do want to say with some energy that one-to-ones are the way to go. I've been having one-to-ones for the last 3 weeks by phone, and I've been disappointed that some, not most, but some churches seem to be putting so much energy into live streaming or recording amazing services that they haven't had time to do those systematic one-to-ones.
It's almost as if they believe that worship services are the most important thing about churches.
And that would be a weird thing to believe, wouldn't it?
It would. And not because worship isn't important, but because worship is just so much larger than standing up, sitting down, singing and saying a liturgy. Exactly. And while we hang all our worship on that activity and say, well, this is what worship looks like, actually, perhaps we need to look at what the Bible says worship looks like. Because the Bible has a really interesting and actually quite broad definition of worship that includes things like kindness to the poor is an act of worship. And it's kind of worth thinking about those while we are struggling with our tech, or perhaps beating ourselves up because we're not able to produce something that is just like the real church service, but from our living rooms. Personally, in my living room at the moment, I have one snory dog. And I have one dog gnawing on a stick. I have one teenager yelling on the Xbox, who you might be able to hear just dimly in the background. And I have another one who is poised as soon as this recording finishes so she can start her music again. So it's not always easy to reproduce in a living room environment what you would do in a set apart space on a Sunday morning. So don't beat yourself up if you're not able to do that, because actually there are many, many, many ways to worship God. And the early church didn't have the resources that we have now. But what they did have was the relationships that they built with one another. And one more thing about one-to-ones, we're not just saying that you, the person who's listening to us right now, should be having one-to-ones.
Though we are saying that.
We are saying that, but we're not just saying that. We're saying, why don't you train all the other people in your church to do lots of one-to-ones? So that by the end of lockdown, lots of people in your church have got to know each other's gifts and significant others and stories and passions.
Should be kind of goss.
What?
No, ignore me. Caroline, before we finish, do you have a poem?
Oh, well, I do always have a poem. Bear with me. This is actually one. So we've had some very sad scenarios where people have lost loved ones and not been able to say goodbye. And I had a profound conversation with somebody the other day who said, I always make sure I don't leave anything unsaid at the moment, because it might be the last conversation I have with someone, and I want to make the relationships I've got strong in case I can't be there at the end. And I'm not trying to be over morbid, but actually it's quite a useful rule of life, even when you're not in a pandemic, to make your relationships so strong that the love that's in them lasts a really long time and can last through, for example, things like busyness or a temporary estrangement or an argument or difficulties or just life getting in the way. And one-to-ones are an amazing tool of doing that, actually, an amazing way of really knowing a person and knowing their story and sharing your own and giving that gift of yourself to somebody else. And I've been speaking to a widow of a dear member of my parish who is really struggling with having lost her husband and not being able to be there and hold his hand. And so it's with people like her in mind that this was written. If I die someday, beyond the scope of your care, beyond the reach of your voice, beyond the touch of your hand, I do not die alone. My heart has stored the memory of your care, my mind the sound of your voice, my body the touch of your hand. I was never alone. If I die someday and the right care is not taken, and the right things are not done, and the right words are not spoken, I forgive you. The tide of your love for me washes out all mistakes, mine and yours. The kindnesses you did for me lasted long enough to cover the gap. The loving things you said to me echoed long enough to drown out the silences. You are always with me. If I die someday and you do not find out immediately, and the world does not feel changed, and the birds sing on and the sun still shines, do not feel guilty. I am glad that the grief circled a while before settling, that there is still joy somewhere and singing, that grief parts its clouds long enough for the sun to warm your face. This is what I want for you. If I die someday and you are left with the loose ends dangling and the unfinished pieces unfinished and the things I would have said, done, written, sung, now impossible, be free to tie up the ends in a bow or leave them, to make what you will of the pieces, they are yours now, to trust that God holds all I was and will be, awaiting our someday reunion. And I think part of that is about building things strongly, building things well, And when my husband goes out volunteering and I'm staying home, we always make sure we have our hug and our kiss before we part. I do my conversations with my family and my friends. I've actually got in touch with people I haven't spoken to in what it turns out has been years, but only feels like months. And we realize our children have got older, our lives are different, and actually we really like each other and we've missed each other. But the busyness of life washed over to such an extent we didn't realize how much we missed each other or how much we valued each other. And I've made new friends who I've actually never met yet in person and can't wait for lockdown to end so that I can actually meet them in person. But I feel like I really know them already from the one-to-one conversations we've had. So I do heartily recommend one-to-ones, not just for leaders, but for the whole of the congregation.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. We have together been
At a distance,
rethinking Christian leadership.